Okay, I'm staying with our focus then on how to promote equity and inclusion in education systems and particularly in schools. We talked about the importance of teacher development and the importance of developing inclusive practices. I want to move the agenda on then to a consideration of what needs to happen at the level of a school to take this forward. What sort of processes go on in a school that moves in a more equitable direction? I keep mentioning experience I've had in different parts of the world around all of this, and typically this has involved myself and my colleagues from university working with schools and education systems using processes of action research of the sort that I've already described, collaborative inquiry, collecting evidence to move a system forward. I want to bring that alive in terms of what it might mean for a school as a whole by giving an example of what this looks like in practice. The approach we've used is about research that tries to make a difference. Obviously, as academics, we have to publish our research. That's how we get judged in the same way that people in schools and education systems get judged. So we have to publish. But the nature of the work my colleagues and I do, we want to make a difference in the field as well, and that would be a legacy of what we do. So we're adopting a stance, a particular stance, social justice if you like. Every child matters and matters equally. We're working with groups and where possible systems, and the approach we use is development and research. Now that's a play on words. Usually what you hear is research and development. You do the research, then you give it to people in the field, and that leads to development. We're doing it in a sense the other way around. We're trying to get involved in real developments and build research into the process to make a difference in that context, but to draw lessons that can be shared on occasions like all of this. So I'm going to take an example of one particular network of schools that we worked with some years ago. It was a network in a local authority with a very diverse set of schools, secondary schools in fact, although we've also done similar things with primary schools. And the network was guided by this agenda of questions. Which learners are most vulnerable to underachievement, marginalisation or exclusion in our schools? In fact, the phrase we used is, who are the students who are missing out? What changes are needed in order to reach out to these students? And how can these changes be introduced effectively and evaluated as we move forward? The process we used was that we invited the schools that participated. Remember, these were secondary schools, some of them very successful, some of them less successful, but all of them were invited to develop a team of staff who would lead the research within their schools. These teams worked with my colleagues and I from the university, and we involved them in focusing on particular groups of learners that they thought were missing out. We encouraged them to play their hunches. What are your hunches? Who are the students who are missing out? Let's look at them in detail. I'll give you some examples in a moment. We then helped them and supported them in gathering various kinds of evidence. Of course, we started with statistics, but we also did observations in lessons. We talked to students individually and in groups through interviews. And we have some of the students taking photographs around the school and talking to us about what the photographs were illustrating about their experiences in the school. The idea of this was to challenge, make people think, and develop practice. And at various meetings of the schools, they would actually share ideas within their schools and between their schools. Let me give examples then of what this might look like and then draw some lessons from all of this. These are 4 examples. One of the schools were concerned about mobility because they saw that as the youngsters went from year 7 at the age of 11 up to year 11, there was quite a lot of children moving from going to other schools, and other students were moving in, particularly as there was a lot of kind of migration into the community, and they wanted to explore why are some of these students leaving and why are some of the students who are arriving finding it difficult. One of the schools were very particularly concerned with underachievement. They had a kind of banding system, so they had classes which contained the more effective, successful learners, if you will, a middle band and a lower band, and they wanted to look at what was happening to those students and why did some drop out. In fact, they ended up concentrating mainly on the middle band. because they found that actually their more successful learners were doing very well, and the least successful learners were getting lots of support, but there was kind of students in the middle who were kind of missing out, and they focused on those youngsters and what could be done about them. Attendance was a big issue in one of the schools. The school was in pretty bad shape, to be honest. And so the staff research team found out what are the factors that are affecting attendance, and their research actually led them to change their thinking about all that. They found there were factors that they hadn't really thought about, some of which were to do with the way the students were being dealt with in school. And it led them to think, we have to change what we do in school to make school more attractive for these youngsters. Perhaps the most interesting case, however, was the fourth case, which is a school where the staff research team were concerned that some youngsters were being overlooked. It was a large secondary school, and they felt there were youngsters who were kind of getting lost. They described these youngsters as being invisible. And they decided that they were going to try and find out about these so-called invisible students and to find out what it is about them that means they are overlooked. Their starting point, well, they concentrated on year 9, and their starting point was a lot of data they had about the progress of year 9, including the data they had on students who got rewards and students who got punishments. So they had quite a lot of statistical data. And when they went through all of this, they found that there was a significant proportion of students, possibly up to about 40%, who very rarely got rewards and very rarely got punishments. They were kind of lost. And the teachers assumed these were youngsters who were kind of in the middle, if you like. But when they looked at the names of these young people and looked at their statistical progress, they found that they weren't necessarily in the middle. Some of them were very low-performing youngsters, as they perhaps expected. Some of them were relatively high-performing youngsters, which was a shock to them. So what we did was we helped them to collect evidence about these so-called invisible students. The teachers, with our help, observed some lessons, and we realised that some of these students could literally go through the day, going from lesson to lesson, without having their name used. We didn't even need to know who these youngsters were, because they were there in the classroom, but sometimes putting their hands up, but usually they were not asked to answer or respond, and often their name was not used during the day. You were left thinking, well, are these youngsters included? Well, yes, they're here. Are they doing okay? Yeah, many of them are doing okay, but couldn't they do better? Couldn't they do better? We interviewed some of these young people as well for the staff, and we did that in groups. We didn't know who was who. We didn't know which were the so-called invisible students and who were the, non-invisible, if you will. But it became evident from the stories. Many of the youngsters were quite angry. I'm talking now about, remember, these are sort of 14-year-olds. Some of them were quite angry and distressed about the way that they were being treated. There's great, amongst adolescents, as you know, there's a great sense of fairness. Are we being treated fairly? Many of the students who were unhappy about all of this were girls. And I remember, for example, one particular girl, and she said, I come every day, I do my homework, I never get into trouble, and nobody ever talks to me. The teacher never deals with me. She said, and sometimes, I'll put my hand up because I want some help, and I'll wait, and then after a while the teacher's coming towards me and she thinks, now's my moment, and then something will happen over there in the classroom, maybe a boy is being disrupted, and the teacher never gets to me. So this sense of unfairness was there, really. Another girl said, she said, I do my homework, I come every day, I behave myself. There are students in this class, usually boys, she said, who actually, if they just behave for a few minutes, they get a reward. Now, the staff team collected this evidence and they presented it to a meeting of the whole staff in the hall one evening, about 100 set of teachers really, and they worked in groups to engage with this evidence. Some of the staff were in denial, some of them said you've only used a small sample, there were all sorts of excuses, if you will. But the good news was that gradually this led to a fairly major, this whole school effort to think about how do we make sure that every member of a class is actually participating, every student is getting their name used, and so on. You see the power of evidence to make us stop and think, to create that interruption that I talked about earlier. So the lessons we drew from this initiative, and confirm from others, that usually schools have untapped potential to improve themselves in ways that will reach out to all learners. Remember what I said. schools know more than they use. For this to happen, it requires increased collaboration in order to make better use of the expertise that's there in the school. An engagement of data, evidence, of all sorts of kinds, not just the statistics, can be a catalyst for this professional learning. And the leadership is a crucial factor in making all of this happen. So, there's some questions for you to think about schools in your particular context, or indeed, those of you who come from a school, from your own school. Is your school organised in ways that encourage collaboration and experimentation amongst the staff members? Are there high expectations for all the students? Are there some invisible students in your school, for example? To what extent does your school have a culture of inclusion? This is often mentioned in the research literature, the idea that schools have cultures, sets of ideas which are often not talked about, which underpin the way people do their business. It's an elusive concept, but clearly we know that schools do have cultures that inform the way people act and respond, and some cultures are more supportive of moving in a more inclusive direction. And there's an important link. One of the great experts on organisational development, a man called Edgar Schein, wrote years ago, "Culture and leadership are two sides of the same coin. The task of those in leadership positions is to create the culture where better use is made of the expertise that is available." I invite you to think about those questions in relation to your own context, and if possible, talk to your colleagues about it.